town hall program reflecting on Thomas Paine's Common Sense 250 years after its original publication. I'm Julie Silverbrook, Vice President of Civic Education at the National Constitution Center. For those who may be joining us for the first time, the National Constitution Center is America's home for nonpartisan constitutional education and civil dialogue. Through programs like this town hall, we bring together leading scholars, journalists, and public thinkers to explore the Constitution, the ideas that shape our democracy, and the habits of civil discourse essential to self-government. These conversations take place at our museum in Philadelphia, online with audiences like you, and increasingly in communities nationwide through our expanding slate of national public programs. Our goal is to make constitutional learning accessible, engaging, and relevant for people of all ages and backgrounds. Today's program is generously sponsored by Citizens Travelers. This town hall, like Common Sense itself, invites us during America's 250th anniversary to reflect on the ideas that helped shape the nation and continue to matter for our shared civic life. When Thomas Paine published Common Sense in January 1776, independence was far from inevitable. He did not write to impress or to obscure. He wrote to persuade, to speak plainly, to invite ordinary people into the responsibility of self-government, and to trust that when citizens were addressed honestly, they would rise to the moment. Few works in American history so clearly show how words and ideas, made accessible, can help reshape a nation's future. That relationship amongst words, ideas, and the American story lies at the heart of the center's work. Visitors will encounter it vividly when our new America's Founding Gallery opens to the public this Friday, February 13th. The gallery traces the great debates and decisions of the nation's founding and features an original printing of Common Sense, showing how powerful words can help ignite a revolution and continue to illuminate the American experiment in self-government across generations. We're honored to be joined today by two leading scholars of Paine's life and legacy, Gary Berton, who's president of the Thomas Paine Historical Association, and a leading voice in preserving and interpreting Paine's revolutionary legacy. He's joined by Scott Cleary, co-editor of New Directions in Thomas Paine Studies and author of The Field of Imagination, whose work explores Paine's ideas, language, and intellectual world. I'm delighted to moderate this conversation as we reflect on Common Sense, Thomas Paine's enduring influence, and what his work still asks of us as citizens 250 years later. Gary, let's start with you. Before Common Sense appeared in January 1776, independence was far from inevitable. What did the political mood look like in the colonies at that moment, and why was Paine willing to argue so plainly for independence when many influential Americans at the time were still hoping for reconciliation?
There was a strong movement in the colonies for reconciliation, led by a lot of notable people. Benjamin Rush was a leader of that, also others. And Washington even said anyone talking about independence he wouldn't accept. And even Washington was turned by Common Sense from reading it. Independence was the point of this instead of reconciliation, and that had to be crushed, that movement for reconciliation. And that lasted all the way up till the Declaration. People were still arguing for reconciliation, mostly the Tories and odds and ends, other people who switched sides at one point after the fighting started. So when Paine, there's only one historian that I found, Pauline Meyer, who died recently, unfortunately. She claimed that Common Sense had no impact on the American Revolution, none. And that was her politics, because she was a John Adams fan. And John Adams is the exact opposite of Thomas Paine's philosophies, and including democracy. So, Scott, you have any points on that?
I think I would answer that, given the battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775 and the siege of Boston that continued through 1775 into March 1776, what Gary said is absolutely right. But there was also a mood where independence was able to grow. There's a fertile ground for the independence argument to be made and to be argued persuasively, as Paine did.
True.
And
True.
I just want to probe a little bit more on this. So the political mood is split, but there is obviously openness to independence. We really want to get to the heart of why the words of common sense were so resonant, right? Emotionally resonant, and why they still resonate today as well. So like what the impact was in that moment in January of 1776 as it's being distributed, and then also why those words still stir so much in us today.
Well, I can say that Paine developed his writing style at a very young age, and he had been writing publicly only with pseudonyms, not his own name, and he was writing since the 1750s, which hardly anybody knows, especially all the historians. Part of our work with the collected writings coming out this spring, we've documented all his writings since the 1750s. And that intense writing period he had between 1763 all the way up to his death, basically. And he worked with some of the famous writers in Britain, including Benjamin Franklin at a very early time, which is not known at all today as well. Will come to question two, and then we'll see about that. Scott will expand on that a lot. So I'll leave it up to him to finish that.
Yeah, Scott, do you want to weigh in on the emotional resonance of Paine's words in Common Sense?
Absolutely. I think he dared to say what many people may have felt but weren't willing to say. Mm-hmm. In the course of Common Sense, he calls the King of England, not Parliament, the King of England, the royal brute of Britain, a ruffian, and an ass instead of a lion. So he is using a kind of language that no one dared to call the King of England in this cause of independence. So I think it's that kind of language that resonates with people. I really appreciate you're talking about emotion, Julie, because in part 3 of Common Sense, he asks the basic question: what unites 13 disparate different colonies into the United States of America? And his answer is sympathy, imagination, emotion itself. Mm-hmm. So not only does he use words that appeal to people, I think he's also creating and tapping into the emotional reality of them contending with a political issue that is a deeply personal issue for a lot of individuals and families.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. Gary, I know you're itching to get to an important point, which is that Paine is often described, rightly or wrongly, I know you're both going to say wrongly, as a failure when he first arrived in Philadelphia. Yet his early life in England, Gary, as you were suggesting, actually shaped him deeply as a thinker and a writer and a communicator. And so what do we miss when we focus on Paine and what position in life he's in just at that moment in Philadelphia, and we don't think about his formative years leading up to 1776? Well, Scott, do you want to take that first, or Gary? Gary, I know you're itching to do it, so you do this one. You start.
Well, the idea of a failure was part of the propaganda to remove Paine from history, and they started early, and they continued to do it. He had support across the board with different class structures in the colonies. He had general support. There's some very wealthy men in the colonies at the beginning, but basically there was a plutocracy forming, and he had a huge backlash about common sense. John Adams burst into his room after he read Common Sense and called it too democratical, and and that argument between Paine and Adams was, there's a great book on that out. If you can help me, Scott, the author's name. I'd like to tell it to him. I'll think of it at the end. So a failure is ridiculous. He was working with the top writers in England. He was writing with a lot with Benjamin Franklin. He didn't just meet him in 1774 and a complete failure, but that's not the story at all.
Well, Gary, maybe for this audience who they might be less familiar with Paine, why was he being portrayed as a failure when he arrived in Philadelphia? Where does that come from?
It didn't happen early. It happened afterwards. It happened after Paine's successes. No one dared, after Common Sense and after the American Crisis, very few people would speak out except for the militant Tories in the colonies. The failure came up part of the eliminating Paine in history, which the leading historians in the 19th century, except for a handful of journalists, the main attack on Paine was that he's irrelevant, that he didn't do anything. And like the Pauline Maier thing, that still lingers in most historians. You can find every single book about Thomas Paine. He was a failure. And then that was started way back, probably in the 1780s, late 1780s, early 1790s. And then the atheist stuff started coming at the same time. And between that he was a nobody, and then propaganda about him being an atheist, which is not true either, it stuck. And future historians just copied what they first said, and they're still copying it. Every single book about Paine is off. So we're correcting that with the collected writings coming out soon. So Scott is definitely anxious to get his 2 cents on this.
I think history kind of retro-engineered his arrival into Philadelphia. As Gary mentioned, his participation in the French Revolution. When Thomas Jefferson invited him back to the United States in 1802 after a 20-year absence, many newspapers vilified Jefferson and Paine for his return. And I think it was Age of Reason, which criticizes institutional religions, his participation in the French Revolution, and kind of what before our collected works was a real blank spot in the documentary and in the archival history of Paine prior to his arrival, created that idea of failure. Don't forget, Paine was one of the first people to have an authoritative negative biography written about him in the 1790s. And in 1809 by a New York City newspaper editor called James Cheatham. So even when Paine was still alive, people were writing destructive, critical biographies of him to try to undermine his reputation. And I think having that kind of quasi-celebrity status in the 18th century, where a lot of people wanted to criticize him for his politics and his beliefs and his ideas, just kind of got immersed into how American history was written.
Good.
So what do we miss when we don't look at Paine's formative years? Because I think we're at a moment as the nation celebrates 250 years, and we have a lot of people who are interested in today's program where we can really unpack Paine for people. Tell us more about his formative years and why it's important to understand those.
I think the story of Paine arriving in Philadelphia in 1774 and writing one of the most important documents in American history about a year and a half later is a quintessential American story. And I think we want to believe it. I think the reality is he was deeply immersed he had a really good political education in England prior to coming to the United States. He was deeply immersed in something called the Patriot Whig political school, which was essentially a Whig version, or I guess we call it left or liberal kind of way of understanding the way the monarchy should run and English politics should run. So Paine is deeply immersed in a political idea and a political school in England that trained him to come to the United States and to argue for independence. He was closely monitoring colonial actions, whether it was the Stamp Act, the Boston Tea Party. Paine was very aware of colonial goings on and arguing as early as the early 1770s for the independence of America, at least from English parliamentary control. So he's trained in this by the time he comes to America. I think that that's what we miss. And this was his the cherry on top of his independence cake.
That's great. Let's get into the ideas advanced in Common Sense. So he advances a pretty radical set of ideas. You've already touched on a little bit of this. So ideas about monarchy, not a big fan. Equality, popular sovereignty, fan. And he does so in language that ordinary readers could grasp. What was genuinely new or disruptive about Paine's arguments in 1776? And why are those ideas so powerful and resonant in that moment?
I'll start. Common Sense was a manifesto of the movement for democratic government. And before Paine wrote Common Sense, all of the progressive people in Britain fighting the monarch, they wouldn't go as far as to create a democracy. They were suspicious of ordinary people. They were it's the well-educated elite in England, and they were hesitant to throw out the monarchy and start with a basic equality amongst people in the country. And the caste structure in England was hard. They were hard to swallow. In the colonies, it's more receptive. The vast majority, the 94% of the population that could not vote after the 1787 Constitution, that's the Constitution Center's study. Only 6% were able to vote. They were afraid of common people, and Paine's entire political structure is based on equality. And any human in the country that's of age was equal to everybody else in terms of rights, human rights, civil rights, all of that, protections from the government. So Common Sense was a manifesto that's still very relevant today. So, Scott, you can add to this, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think as I mentioned earlier, willing to skirt the idea of treason by calling the King of England a ruffian and a royal brute. Willing to quote popular literature of the day, including John Milton's Paradise Lost, one of the most famous English poems in America at the time, but quoting Satan as a character in that. It's also about him wanting to appeal to sympathy and to emotion. It's his idea in the introduction when he says, time makes more converts than reason. It's him understanding that if independence was not seized at that particular moment, then it would have been a fleeting opportunity. So I think it's that language of insistence and of necessity and of equality, as Gary said, that were the most disruptive in Common Sense.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about the style that it was written in, the language choices. Very intentional in its orientation to reaching more people and not necessarily just the elite. Scott, do you want to talk a little bit about the decision to do that?
Absolutely. I think it works on two different levels. One, he does not reference any classical Roman author. He does not mention Seneca. So you do not need to have an elite education in order to understand his argument. He speaks in what has been called a vulgar style, not vulgar meaning bad, but vulgar meaning the language of the common people, not needing to have an elite education in order to understand these high-minded political ideas. It's also, and what I'm fascinated in as an English professor, as I said, are the sources that he uses. He quotes John Milton's Paradise Lost. His argument against monarchy is based entirely on the book of Samuel from the Bible, which almost all of his readers would have had familiarity with in the 18th century as one of its most important texts, the Bible. So it is Paine's ability to not speak down to his readers, but speak at the same level as his readers that is so important about his language. And it's his ability to pull from their shared literary culture in order to make political arguments for independence. I think that's the most radical thing he does in terms of his language and his style in Common Sense.
And the pamphlet Common Sense, it has real reach, right? Reach unlike any other political pamphlet that was put into distribution before it. How was the pamphlet circulated at the time, and how was it received across different segments of society?
A lot of the people who heard of Common Sense could not read, and they were meetings of Common Sense being read aloud. So one copy could have circulated amongst hundreds of people. It's passed around, it's read to groups aloud. So that's why it spread so quickly.
I think too, you have to understand the 18th century was a letter writing century. And you can read letters from almost any place in the colonies between January and, say, even July 1776, private personal letters or even diplomatic correspondence. Everybody's talking about Thomas Paine. If, as Gary said, they're not reading it themselves, if they can't read, they're listening to someone read it aloud. They are writing letters saying, have you heard about this Common Sense? You need to get a copy. You need to read this. For both positive and negative, there were also loyalists who read it and said, you have to read this Common Sense. It's an absolute piece of trash. But it's circulating in all of these different methods and venues that are available to everybody in the 18th century.
And regardless of how it's received, it makes an impact, right? So in what concrete ways did the pamphlet actually accelerate the movement toward independence?
Immediately after Common Sense was circulated, the end of February, beginning of March, there were 96 declarations of independence written by every town, colony, region, 96 declarations of independence. Part of Common Sense, the climax of Common Sense, going to the, at the end of it, he literally outlined the Declaration of Independence in there. And in the Declaration itself mimicked what was in Common Sense. So when all those 96 between, I'll say March to May, were 96 of these declarations from the lower sized towns all the way up to a whole colony. And that flooded in from newspapers, local newspapers spread around, and the movement for calling a declaration and being formed in a procedure into the Continental Congress taking it up came from that movement amongst the people in the colonies. And it was an overwhelming wave, that political tidal wave, actually, for that activity. And still, it was very close to passing. They had to make a lot of compromises for slavery. They had to make, even though they denounced slavery in the Declaration, it was motivated by Paine's group. I'll introduce this. It was called the Whig Society. And no historian, I've seen one book out of the hundreds of books about Paine and the period mention that name, Whig Society.
Can you tell our audience more about the Whig Society?
Whig Society, it was Paine's closest comrades in America, and it consists of Timothy Matlack, Charles Wilson Peel, James Cannon, David Rittenhouse, Thomas Young, a famous activist who died 77 on the battlefield. So with these people, and Franklin, until he left in 78, he was part of this group. It was officially named in 77, and they fought the pamphlet wars to get a Declaration of Independence. James Cannon and Paine and Young all contributed greatly to the pamphlet wars in newspapers, and it spread the idea of getting a declaration. So that movement of common sense triggered through the Declaration of Independence that people were clamoring for, a national one, was decisive in that movement.
Scott, is there anything else you want to add on how the pamphlet moved society in concrete ways toward declaring independence?
Yeah, I agree with Gary. I think it's Paine's connections to the powder keg of Philadelphia politics that really helped connect common sense to the Declaration. And a good exercise is just to read Common Sense and then read the Declaration of Independence and start to see how similar they are. And our viewers may want to start thinking about how closely Paine is connected to the Declaration of Independence. Maybe our story about that needs to change as well a little bit.
Can you either or both of you kind of map those through lines from common sense through to the text that's actually reflected in the Declaration of Independence?
Everybody knows the end of common sense was an outline for a declaration. He had about 4 or 5 points that need to be in the Declaration. They were all in the Declaration, and it was carried by this group, the Whig Society, to that period when the Declaration was being argued. And the writer of it, Jefferson, had no idea about independence. I hate to undermine the Jefferson fans, but on his way to Philadelphia at the end of May, he wrote a friend that said, they're going to tell us what to say about independence. He had no opinion on independence at the end of May, right before he started work on the Declaration. There were many hands in the Declaration, the committee especially, the Committee of Five contributed ideas. Franklin was a dominant writer of the Declaration, and I can go into that, but I don't want to get undermining the Declaration authorship of Jefferson at this point, but it'll happen soon. So the common sense, if it wasn't written, there would never have been an American Revolution. There would never have been a Declaration of Independence, and we would be drifting on, and King Charles would be on our money at this point if that didn't happen. So that's how big common sense is. Go ahead.
Can we map out the 4 key pieces that he felt were necessary for a Declaration of Independence?
No, you're relying on my memory having credit so much. It called for, by memory, I can't give it in that exact order, and I think I can pick out three or 4 of them. Scott, jump in anytime and save me here. It called for, obviously, separation. It called for a meeting of the people to actually write a national declaration. That was point 1 probably. And I can't list them top of my head, but
I think too, he said they need a charter. So he said we need a document to proclaim our independence.
Exactly.
He gives them the argument why monarchy is absolutely an illegitimate form of government that no one in their right mind would want to live under. And talking about the creation of a legislature and creation of some kind of government structure that would be a response to independence.
Yeah.
So I think those are probably the four best.
Well, the call for a legislature to govern is a good segue into another area of uh, the misunderstanding of Thomas Paine. So he is frequently quoted as being hostile to government, and yet his writings actually consistently argue for just and representative government as essential to freedom and security. How has his political philosophy been misunderstood over time, and why does that misunderstanding matter?
Well, I'll start then. There were many political movements in the country as it developed, and things like libertarianism, things like anarchism, they didn't want any central governments. And that was a very minor trend in American politics. Paine was never hostile against government, never. He depended on government to ensure rights and equality. That was the purpose of government. Everyone should be equal. And to say that he was hostile to government is saying that he was an anarchist, and it's completely wrong. And I've heard people say that a lot. People who have libertarianism sentiments would try to grab Paine as one of their examples, and it's not accurate at all. He works constantly on government. He dissertations on government in the 80s, in the 1795, coming out of jail, and he laid it out again over and over again that he never changed his tune on that. The only slight difference that he accepted is that instead of a one body like our House of Representatives, instead of one body, it should be split into two equal at random, two bodies, and argue with that, argue in each one separately, and then join on the same issue. So Paine is pro-government, extremely pro-government.
I think it's a function of two things. I think the first is his line in Common Sense, where all government is but a necessary evil. And it depends on if you want to focus on the part that government is necessary, or do you want to focus on the part that government is evil? And I think it's literalizing that statement and not believing Paine developed an idea outside of that is part of the reason for this. I think too is kind of symptomatic of American history only reading Paine's American Revolutionary documents and not reading Paine beyond 1783 and the Treaty of Paris, when the revolution technically finishes. As Gary said, throughout the 1780s, 1790s in France, he advocates for just, equitable government and just representation for all peoples in government. I would encourage all of our viewers, if you have the opportunity, read his letters, 8 letters to the citizens of the United States, which he writes on his return to America at Thomas Jefferson's invitation between 1802 and 1804. They're 8 beautiful letters, highly critical of the John Adams administration, but they're beautiful letters about the necessity of government, about the aftermath of the Revolution, the heritage of the American Revolution, and how important it was to developing a fair, just, and equitable government.
Yep.
That's great. And of course, I think it's really valuable when studying any figure in history to look at the full body of their writing, and not just a single pamphlet. And you brought something up earlier. I think it was you, Gary, that there was an early negative biography about Paine that you feel kind of shaped the narrative for Paine moving forward. Talk a little bit. I just want to touch on that just a little bit more before we turn to some other elements of Paine's biography.
Yeah, well, Scott brought this up. It was a lord in the House of Lords in Britain hired a writer to write a biography of Thomas Paine. So you can understand the content is going to be extremely distorted. And this is where the rumors of being a drunk, being a failure, and all that came from that book. And to everyone's chagrin at this point, is so many historians since, including up to recent times, they picked that information up from that book as being a true thing. And it was just a hit job against Paine. The monarchy wanted to discredit Paine completely. And so that first book is still in circulation in the minds of many historians. And the failure business and the drunken business all come from that book.
And do you think that book played a role in why Paine, although Common Sense, I think, is duly recognized as being hugely influential in the road to independence, Paine himself lives outside the pantheon of famous founders. Do you think that book is a critical part of why that's the case?
If I can jump in, Gary, I think so. The 1790s was a really potent time for Paine's relationship to America. His participation in his very energetic participation in the French Revolution, when that revolution was not well received over here, given its level of violence. We can't not mention the 1796 letter to George Washington, which at the time when Jefferson had given up the presidency and is seen as one of the greatest men in American history, even at that point, Paine deeply, crudely criticizes Washington. I think that more than anything contributes to it. Now, Paine had a reason for that. Paine was in prison for 1 year during the French Revolution, and he was led to believe that Washington did nothing to rescue him from prison. So it was a very personal hurt that Paine felt when he wrote the letter to Washington in 1796. But writing it at that moment when he did, when Jefferson is at his ascendancy historically, certainly contributed to his reputation. And the 1792, if anybody wants to find it on Google, is by Francis Oldys, Oldys. You can still read it. But there's also an 1809 American biography, as I've said, by James Cheatham, a New York City newspaper editor, that repeated many of the same lies about Paine and then said Paine was the exact same on his return, that he was homeless, that he was itinerant, he had no friends, he was poor, none of which were historically or archivally true. So I think it's that participation in a foreign revolution that was not well received in America, criticizing George Washington at the time when he's starting to become the George Washington, and a number of biographies, both in England and here in America, that completely aim to undermine and destroy his reputation.
And I add one thing. There's a book called American Aurora, Aurora, by Richard Rosenfeld, who just died recently. That's too bad. We were friends for over 20 years, and he was a journalist. He wasn't a historian. All he did was dig up the facts of the letter to Washington. And he proves in the center of the book how everything that Paine said in the letter to Washington is absolutely true. And he dug up all these from original source documents. It's not his opinion is not in the book. He's only presenting facts in an organized way. And I would suggest to everybody who's interested in this whole subject is to read that American Aurora. It's in paperback now. It's a long read, but it's all in there if you're interested in that. So that Washington was kept. I'm sorry. Washington was kept out of, Washington was kept out of the loop about Paine being in jail, and Paine didn't know that. So he expected to be, released from Washington, and he never heard a word. So That's why he was
Governor Morris
bitter.
is the villain in all this.
Yes,
I hope there are no Governor Morris fans out
That's
there,
right.
but if you are,
Well, there
Governor
may
Morris is
be.
the villain.
So let's talk about that, right? Let's talk about Gouverneur Morris's role here.
Oh, well, I mean, I call Thomas Paine America's first whistleblower. If people don't know the story of the Silas Deane affair, where Silas Deane was sent by Congress to bring over a gift from France of weapons and other armaments for the American Revolution. And even though it was a gift, Silas Deane charged Congress, and Silas Deane tried to get money from Congress for something that was supposed to be a free gift from France. Paine was a secretary to Congress's Committee of Foreign Affairs, essentially their foreign affair body, and was held to secrecy. But Paine felt that Silas Deane's violation of the trust that the American people and Congress had put in him warranted Paine spilling the beans. And so in a series of newspaper articles at the end of 1778, early 1779, Paine revealed that France had gifted America a set of weapons and armaments in violation of a treaty that France was not supposed to break. So this was some political trouble Paine was getting into. But he felt that what he saw, and as Gary said, history has kind of vindicated Paine in this. Deane's violation and Deane's graft needed to be revealed. And so Gouverneur Morris was very pro Silas Deane and politically was allied with Silas Deane. So the animosity, a little like his animosity with John Adams, Paine's animosity with Gouverneur Morris kind of goes a long way from back to the time of the American Revolution. And when Gouverneur Morris, before James Monroe, was the American ambassador to France in the 1790s, he absolutely refused to acknowledge Paine as an American citizen and therefore free him from a French prison. So the politics of the American Revolution absolutely were still at play during the French Revolution for Americans over in France.
I want to talk a little bit about Paine's role during the Revolution itself, but before I do, I recently had a conversation for a town hall about James Wilson, and we talked about why some founders are forgotten or don't get the same level of, I'll say, positive attention. And so one of the factors I believe that's critical is whether or not you have an early champion. Somebody who wants to talk about your positive attributes, and then also somebody who's in the business of collecting your correspondences and putting them in a format where they can be explored potentially for public consumption. Does Paine have any early champions, or is he primarily just plagued by critics?
Yeah, he had a lot of champions, especially in England. Carlyle and his wife, when they tried to print some of Paine's works, they both got into prison. I think one of the Carlyles died in prison. So yeah, there was a lot of support. All the working men's associations in the late 90s and into the 19th century, they all drank to Paine's name. They all they celebrated his role in liberation from England, and that went on from the mass of the people underground. However, that didn't tarnish the Federalists. They were going after Paine constantly, and it was a struggle. They tried to well, I'll skip that point. Let's go on to something else. Go ahead.
Scott, is there anything that you wanted to reflect on?
Yeah, I mean, your viewers might know that when Paine arrived in Philadelphia, he had 2 letters of recommendation written by Benjamin Franklin with him. So I think Franklin is an early friend and supporter, but not a champion. I think Paine has numerous letters with the Laurens family from South Carolina, Henry Laurens and his son John Laurens. Mm-hmm. So these are our early champions. Although I will note that after the Revolution, Paine crossed the aisle a number of times and wrote with people such as Robert Morris, with whom he was not allied politically, to help build the new institutions of the United States. So I think it's Paine's ability to irritate the right people and work across the aisle that didn't give him any explicit champion, but a number of supporters.
Let's talk a little bit about what Paine actually did during the Revolutionary War, because he did more than just write, although he did author The American Crisis during the war, during a particularly dark period in the war. How did his experience during the war shape his understanding of the role of citizens in sustaining constitutional democracy? Scott, do you want to tackle this one first?
I mean, many people may know Paine took almost no payment for any of his writings. If he had taken the payments for Common Sense, he would have been a very wealthy man. But he gave that money to the revolutionary cause to buy clothing and mittens and boots for the soldiers. We have letters where Paine is talking to prominent Philadelphia businessmen like the Irishman Blair McClanahan, talking about giving $500 to support the troops and starting to get a coalition of citizens together to financially support the troops. Paine is concerned about procurement and how to get supplies to soldiers. Paine is thinking about recruiting soldiers and how to maintain recruitment levels. In the Second Crisis paper, Paine talks about the misery of people in New Jersey as the British Army marches through and invades their homes and destroys their homes for firewood. So Paine is always an advocate for citizens participating materially, financially, politically, in whatever way they can to any kind of united political effort. He himself was a secretary to Daniel Robichaux. He was an aide-de-camp to the great Nathaniel Greene, the general from Rhode Island. As I said, he served on Congress's Committee for Foreign Affairs as its secretary. He was never elected to a position. He served as the clerk of the Pennsylvania Assembly between 1780 and 1781. So he helped his local Pennsylvania government. So he did have governmental roles, just not elected ones. But he completely understood that in his position, he could encourage and rally regular citizens to participate in the war effort as he did, and other political endeavors.
Gary, is there anything you want to add on his revolutionary role and how that impacted his views on the responsibility of citizens in sustaining constitutional democracy, or just ideas in general on sustaining constitutional democracy?
Yes. I think technically he was the only person in the government that also fought in the war. It's a very rare thing to do. He was playing both ends. He was doing service in the government. He was doing service on the battlefield temporarily, but he did continue. He spent time in Valley Forge, and from notes from other people, he went out and spied behind enemy lines when the British controlled Philadelphia. He went down and looked at down across the river from Philadelphia in New Jersey to spy and come back. So he was on the move on everything. He never sat still. There was one thing I wanted to say. Let me think. No, let's move on. We're running out of time anyway. So,
well, let me
get
ask
to the last two for sure.
So we've touched on the reasons why, despite his extraordinary influence, he has been excluded from many of the founding narratives. And we spent a little bit of time talking about the role that his criticism of Washington played in that exclusion. But I think there are two other areas that have been identified as reasons why that might also be the case. And one is his religious writings, and the other is his direct involvement with the French Revolution. So can you guys tell us a little bit more about both what he wrote on related to religion and his role in the revolution, and how that might have also impacted perceptions of Paine, both at the time and over American history?
right, I'd like to start this, and Scott can help. Paine, trying to phrase this properly. It's happened to many countries that the myth of the founding of every country exists. They create heroes, they create events that happened that epitomize what they want the country to be. And the French Revolution was, Paine wrote a constitution for France. He didn't write it alone. There were 9 people composing a new constitution in France, and Paine adopted the Constitution in Pennsylvania. It's the most progressive, democratic constitution that was ever created in the world to this day. And there was a war amongst you have to think of a name for it, but plutocracy is the closest one I can get to. They needed to crush democracy to be controlled over the government. And the Constitution did that in 1787. When Paine read the 1787 Constitution, he sent a message back that it was monarchical. And John Adams was ecstatic because it was monarchical. And that's where the 6% people voting comes from. And gradually little increments came, but, think 100 years ahead of the 1780s. And we were still in a problem of equality in the country, and we're still a problem today. And Paine's Constitution was based on equality, which means equal opportunity, civil rights, the whole works. So why Paine was excluded was because democracy is excluded. And I know that's a big thing to swallow, because the Constitution and democracy often go in the same sentence, and it's not true. I don't think it's true, but go ahead.
We'll unpack that a little bit. So that's Paine's view, and you're a student of Paine, and so your view. Unpack that a little bit.
Well, the uprisings in all countries in the world in the 19th century and in America as well, of the small revolutions, the upsurges, especially France, when they returned to the monarchy in 1813, thanks to Lafayette. So constitutions should be written from the people. And Paine lays out what the Constitution should be. And Britain never had a constitution. They still don't. They don't. Paine believed that the people must create the Constitution. How you do it is a major thing. It's every country has to decide how to do it. And we never went through that. We had a small group of people, every one of them, the richest people. This has been proven by several books, going back to Beard in 1930s, documenting the people at the Constitutional Convention, and every one of them were the richest people in the country. So from that, we have a limited Constitution, very limited, and we haven't corrected it sufficiently, but that's my opinion. But the truth is, the richest people wrote the Constitution, despite the Bill of Rights. The French Bill of Rights were detailed in the 1793 convention in France that Paine helped develop, and it was modeled on the Pennsylvania Constitution. The Pennsylvania Constitution had to be eliminated when it became one country, and all the constitutions had to conform to it. Things like a Senate, Paine called it an abomination at some point, and the Senate nullifies the House of Representatives, and the executive became the power. Everything was built upside down, in terms of Paine's constitutional structure. He wanted removing justices of the Supreme Court for ill deeds, and a lot of changes. So his constitution is upside down. The House of Representatives forms the laws. There's no Senate. And the laws that are passed by the representatives are dictated to the executive, whose only function is to implement the law. And that's it. And the Constitution is upside down. And according to Paine and many other people.
And Gary, where is he writing his criticisms of the federal Constitution of 1787 and extolling the virtues of the Pennsylvania Constitution?
The source is in coming out in spring, but he was quoted as I believe in a letter. Scott, you can attested to that.
So this was in correspondence. This isn't something he publishes publicly. Okay.
Right. But
although in Dissertations in Government in the 1780s, he does throw some criticisms at the constitutional procedures.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, this is an important point considering what we're dealing with in modern times. The Constitution does not protect the citizenry. It doesn't protect it.
Let's, in the interest of time, one is we want people to take a look at, it's your next volume of Paine's collected writings, where that letter, where he discusses his criticisms of the federal Constitution, that comes out when, that new volume?
Yeah, Gary and I are both senior editors at a new 6-volume of Paine's works and correspondence that's going to be published by Princeton University Press in May or June.
Great. And so we'll keep an eye out for that letter. That's a really interesting exploration on early founding views of the federal Constitution. So maybe we'll have you guys come back for a conversation about that. We only have a couple of minutes left, so I just want to close with last thoughts from each of you on what revisiting common sense as the nation celebrates its 250th anniversary this year, what revisiting it will offer to Americans today. Why should they go and read it?
Well, Scott is more eloquent than I am, so I'll get my 2 cents in quick. The common sense was the manifesto of democracy, governmental democracy. And that was spread to the age of democratic revolutions. All the revolutions, South America, spread to Russia, it spread into Europe in places. Common sense was the source of all that. Rights of man jettisoned it further, but the principles in Rights of Man were the same as what they were in common sense. They were just expanded. So, Scott?
I'll leave it to Paine himself, who in Common Sense said, we have it in our power to begin the world over again. Mm-hmm. That's the reason to go back to common sense, because every American who wants to understand independence, but every American who wants to participate in the civic life that we live nowadays can read it in Paine. We have it in our power to begin the world over again.
Very good.
Gary, Scott, thank you so much for a wonderful conversation about Thomas Paine and common sense. Folks can check out excerpts of Common Sense on the National Constitution Center's website. And please come visit us when our new America's Founding Gallery opens this coming Friday, February 13th, to see an original printing of Common Sense. Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.
And thank you, Julie, for hosting.